Welcome to Speak Sex. I am your host, Eurydice, and today we are going to speak to two young folk I know, Chloe and Jessie. Chloe is a PhD student in sociology and women and gender studies at Yale University. And she goes by the pronoun she, her, and Jessie, who is her partner, is a PhD student in English and women and gender studies at UC Berkeley, and they go by the pronoun they, them. So welcome to the podcast. The reason I really wanted to speak to you it has been that, you're studying, reading about, where women's issues are at the moment. And one of the reasons for this podcast, for the existence of the podcast, was this, it just kind of put it out there so people around the world and really till the end of time, can access these conversations, both in the present and in the future, when we, somehow we become part of the history. So I feel that part of what interests me is that we are in a process of opening up and changing the language. So I would like, to speak with you about that. What I personally love about the present moment and about the contribution, of your generation so far, is exactly that. I feel that, language is a point of view, right? So we don't think of it that way. We think that language is just, like the objective way of saying something. But in fact, it's a subjective choice that has been handed down to us by those who educated us, right? So when we learned to speak at the age of 2 or 3 or 4, we were told what things mean and how to see them, and that's a point of view. So, for example, like a simple way for me to explain this is that the moon is always full, right? But where we are and how we see it, of course, it's not, right? The sun is always out, but not to us. So I feel like language is exactly that. It's our point of view. It's how we see the moon or the sun, and once that's kind of clear to everyone, I think that our relationship with language will be less, rigid, more creative, and that's, in my understanding of it, one of the ways to get out of the stranglehold of the patriarchy of the dominant culture that we have all been conditioned in. So, for example, going by they them to me is a very simple way of taking charge of that. I'm not just an I. I'm not one. I am a multiplicity, right? So anyway, so that's one topic that I wanted to hear your opinions on. Kind of like how we're updating the language of sex and gender and our place, its place in the culture, and then I would like to hear more generally your point of view of where, let's say, the dominant feminism, which is, in part the Me Too movement, and in part, let's say, the movement to elect women or female-identifying representatives and officials, where that movement is now, in 2020.
Great.
Yeah, lots of really big questions. And do you
what place you want to start? You could do feminism first, and then language. I feel like you're way better with the language stuff. So maybe feminism first and then.
Sure.
Sure. So thank you for your questions, Eve. It's very exciting to get to talk to you about these kinds of topics. And Jesse and I we planned a little bit of what we want to say, but I'm also glad to hear you have all these questions about language and the way that we speak about pronouns. But first, I'm going to talk a little bit about the idea of like where this where the dominant theory of feminism is going, and what I see for a future in feminism. And so I think one of the first things I want to say that to some people may be very obvious and to others is not so obvious. It wasn't obvious to me until I started college, but that there are a lot of different kinds of feminism in the world right now, and have always historically existed. So there is no like one feminist theory, even though a lot of different types of political projects and theoretical perspectives, like you were saying with language, go under the signifier of the word feminism. So one of the things that I wanted to talk about in terms of different branches and different types of feminism, and where we're going like today, or at least where I see like young people turning their focus, and what I see to be like a more progressive agenda for feminism. I first want to talk about this like concept of patriarchy, which for a long time was a word and a perspective that really revitalized me as like a young person coming into feminism, especially I think growing up in Miami, I just had never heard of feminism until I went to college, and I read a bunch of truly I had never heard of it. And I went to college.
That's so funny. I'm sorry.
I know, it's really funny. And I started reading a bunch of like early feminist works and became really enamored by the idea of patriarchy. But as I have dug deeper into, as I have dug deeper into like feminist theory and my own studies of feminism, I think that I have begun to see a lot of flaws in what I see to be issues with the concept of patriarchy, and how I see feminism today moving beyond this structure of patriarchy as the dominant framework of political progress. So one of the big challenges, I think, to this concept of patriarchy is that it splits the world into two groups, men and women. And it assumes in the model of splitting the world into two groups of men and women, we see all women as being oppressed by all men. And one of the issues with this perspective for feminism is that it tends to render all women to the same category and generally tends to erase major differences between them. And what I think that has happened is that this patriarchal perspective renders women to a category of sameness, which means that those who have political, economic, and social power tend to rise to the top of the group and speak on behalf of all women. And usually these tend to be white women who have some kind of like economic and social power. And a lot of the time, the result of this has been a repeated effort by white women to speak on behalf of all women, largely marginalizing the interests of women who are more at the margins of society, including poor women, women of color, and women with disabilities. So there have been like a variety of different moments in the history of feminism and history of like women's liberation movements in which this phenomena in which white women have attempted to speak on behalf of all women, oftentimes trying to separate themselves from people of color, including men of color and women of color, as a way to gain political power in order to align themselves with white men, oftentimes very explicitly saying like the goal of feminism is to be at the same level of white men. There are certain like political projects that I think exemplify this the most. For example, something like focusing on the wage gap. Well, of course, the wage gap is technically bad. It puts a lot of emphasis on trying to make sure that, like, for example, white women are making the same amount of money as white men, which is not necessarily focusing on groups of women who are most marginalized, which I think is
I completely agree. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think when we begin to like challenge what I think is like one of the dominant paradigms of feminism today, being this like idea of patriarchy, the question might be like, okay, so what's next? Like, if feminism is fractured, if there's a bunch of different theories of feminism, if a lot of them come from different perspectives and not all of them are explicitly anti-racist or explicitly class conscious, what are the progressive developments in feminism that young people are finding really exciting, if it's not something like a patriarchal structure, especially given like the things that I identified as being the most disappointing to me about the patriarchy framework, being that it doesn't really account for like intersections of like race and class and ability. So what I wanted to plug in terms of like where I think feminism going today really is a focus on what is called abolition feminism. And I see this, abolition feminism has been along for a very long time, but I see young people getting really excited about it. And abolition feminism is most famously, Angela Davis most famously advocates for abolition feminism, and it's a Marxist feminist movement that is explicitly anti-capitalist, anti-racist, anti-prison, anti-police, which I think is a lot of those issues. I think a lot of people are like, how are those feminist issues and why are those women's issues? And what abolition feminism would say is that in order to have an analysis of gender violence that looks at the way that gender violence really impacts women differently, different kinds of women differently, and looks at all of the ways that women are impacted differently, you need to find a systemic analysis of gendered violence and gender oppression. And when you look at a systemic analysis of gender violence and gender oppression, what you're going to find is that this gendered violence is rooted in racial structures and deeply tied to racism and a history of racism and racial oppression in the United States. And some of the biggest structures of that racial oppression and in turn that gendered violence are things like the police, the incarceration system, and a capitalist economic system. So, yeah, that's
Yeah. Thank you for that clarification. I think that name, abolition feminism, makes a lot of sense to me. I hope it does to our listeners. But I do want to add that basically modern feminism as we know it, has traditionally come right after civil rights movements, and it was through their understanding of civil rights that women, thought that like our turn should also be here, so I feel like in America, at least, it was the movement for the abolition of slavery that inspired women who were, helping that movement to also consider, wanting to become human beings with rights themselves, to even kind of like think of themselves that way, to conceive it, right? So in a way, it was, by helping men who had been, oppressed and marginalized in the same way that women were oppressed and marginalized, by being stuck in a category that was easy, right? It was, optically easy. So, but it was basically the same hierarchy. I feel that, the hierarchy that began with the need of like the male to own and control the womb and its products, the female body, the fertile female body and its products, that same need kind of that need originally created the system of hierarchy where, the male, or at least the patriarch, the strong male, the macho male, right, could own, control, possess the woman who had his children in order to control the genetic line. And from that, the organization of the social system in hierarchical ways basically began, and then it was easy to replicate and, use and take advantage of other, categorize of other like human categories, right? So whether it was children, where children were like sold, whether it was for labor or for marriage or whatever, or whether it was, people that had some distinct otherness, so they could not be confused with like the patriarch, the special, the special kind of like dominant male. I feel that it was that system that, recreated itself endlessly, and it still does. So whatever and wherever we may be, we're in places, in relations, in power relations of like hierarchy. It's really hard to stay, in relations of like equal exchange, because we have been trained to think in the binary ways of hierarchical systems. So yeah, I feel that feminism kind of like gains from its allyship with these other civil rights movements that are not gender based, because we kind of like are experiencing the same types of like violence and oppression, and there is something that I feel strongly about, which is came out of the civil rights movement, that you cannot use the tools of the master to take down the master, right? So if we just speak in the same language, like wages, if I become, if I become a CEO in my pantsuit, why don't I get as much money as the white CEO? Like, how many people are we talking about, right? It just seems like not at all an important issue compared to, what's happening to like millions of oppressed people, including those of the female gender, in America and worldwide. So yeah, I think that terminology is powerful. Abolition feminism, and it clarifies a lot. So thank you.
I just thought I might respond to some of these points that you're raising and that have come up in the conversation so far about, on the one hand, the relationship between feminism and the civil rights movement, which I'm certainly not an expert in, but I think there's a lot to be said on that front, and as well as before getting to that, this question about the nature of patriarchy and the relationship between like female reproductive capacities and male possession and domination of women as a sort of political economy, or like an economics of sex, right? So this is as you said, like in the 70s was very much like a classic point in radical feminist thinking, that and Simone de Beauvoir talks about this in Second Sex, and it's like that that the male oppression of females or men's oppression of women is like the oldest oppression in the books. Like it's the first one, and it's kind of the most important one, and we see it in contemporary society, and we see it in nature, right? So I think it's so part of the argument was that it's precisely through reproduction and through the different roles played in sexual reproduction that this discrepancy, this kind of oppression happens, right? But my own interest in this comes from kind of work that I do on trans people in biology, I guess. And there's a long history within the feminist movement of kind of contesting this view of oppression, of women's oppression, as being kind of transhistorical, or of existing for all time, and being something that's even exists in nature. To overcome, we have to completely give up on nature and have nothing to do with nature in order to become kind of like free people, right? So this is the idea that that certain that it got a lot of pushback, I guess, from certain angles.
I don't. Could you just explain how do we give up on nature? What are they saying?
Yes. Okay. So I guess the idea is if women's oppression is based on the role played in reproduction, then this would kind of pose a problem for feminism where women are biologically put in a position of oppression, right? So this is like a theoretical problem for feminism that happened in the 70s. Was you have on the one hand sort of like technological futurist feminists who are like, well, then the solution is going to be we have to kind of no longer reproduce with our bodies. We have to find
God, yeah.
getting away from this if the body is the problem. But a lot of other feminists were much more committed to the idea of challenging the idea that biology was such an important part of or played such a big role in women's oppression, and that women's oppression might actually be better understood through other kinds of social and cultural organization, right? So a big part of this then is in the 70s and earlier is the fight against housework and against being confined to being a housewife, right? Which rather than focusing really so much on biology, was more about the kind of work and the kinds of exclusions from work that are forced upon women in a patriarchal society, right? So I guess part of the interest in this direction, I mean, as the two of you have already brought up, is on the one hand, it seems to produce the kind of liberal feminism that we're very used to seeing, and that kind of, especially in recent years, seems to have run out of steam in some ways. That
it totally ran out of steam in the last election.
Where it's like as if there's this as has been said, like this idea that maybe if we just have like Hillary Clinton for president or like 2 billionaire women, that somehow this is going to this is the thing that everyone is invested in, and this is the most important thing for women everywhere. So obviously this is one direction that it moved in. The other direction has been more to question who women are, or what it means to have a women's movement, I think, fundamentally. Because the position of that housewife and of being like an unpaid worker is something that was racially determined as well, especially in my background in reading this is more in kind of a British colonial context, but in the US, obviously the experience of womanhood is, if we define it in terms of the kind of work that people do and the kind of work that people get paid for and the kinds of houses that people work in or doing housework in and stuff like this, then there's huge differences in experience across racial lines. And I know Chloe can speak more to this, but so a big critique of what was called the Wages for Housework movement in the 1970s came from feminists of color, the Combahee River Collective, Bell Hooks, and Angela Davis, of course, who point to the way in which this idea of womanhood as like being excluded from the workforce and a specific kind of women's oppression was actually like very much coded as white women's oppression. A key criticism of feminism for over 100 years, since the 1890s even, has been this kind of repeated way in which the feminist movement, by being kind of unmarked and universal and speaking for everyone, continually centers white women's experiences and frames them. And this is a good way of getting back to the question of the relationship between civil rights and feminism. The feminism very often has historically become a white woman's feminism, or become like a sort of shouldn't a kind of liberal girl boss feminism of like. And this is so the key point that I would like to sort of make here, and it's one that I learned from Bell Hooks in Anti-Woman, is that often when the feminist movement and the movement for women's liberation is framed as a response to the civil rights movement, so in the civil rights movement, Black people are moving for liberation. In the women's rights movement, it's going to be women who are pushing for liberation. The immediate question is, well, what about Black women, right? What's the stake of Black women in the civil rights movement, and are Black women included in the women's movement of the 1970s? And so what Bell Hooks draws attention to, which has been an enormous lesson for me, is the way in which a description of feminism that compares itself to the civil rights movement and says, like, but that was for Black people, this is for women, necessarily imagines itself not to have Black people in it, for one thing, and secondarily has a tendency to define itself as as an effort to establish racial solidarity of white women with white men, right? Surely we should be in this group and be getting paid as much, given, on the basis of like shared whiteness, and has therefore kind of often lost interest in or left behind or even worked against the liberation of women of color, of migrant women, of poor women. And so I think this is part of the I guess, to just tie this up, like, I think the reason that the interrogation of what it is to be a woman and who is the sort of we that gets talked about in the movement for women's rights, a key reason to keep this under interrogation is precisely because when we assume a transhistorical idea of man and woman, from nature into the present, or when we talk in the present just about like womanhood, it's not. It's often an exaggeration of one kind of experience at the exclusion of others potentially. So I think,
I agree. I mean, I think that actually the changes that have happened, moving us away from nature without judging them, have helped us come to this place where we can imagine the patriarchy being obsolete. The fact that we have, trans men who can give birth, right? And we have, of course, paternity tests, so you don't need to get married to know who your kids are, and we have all the options in birth besides the natural one, in vitro or surrogacy or. So I feel that, and of course, same-sex marriage, which speaks of some marriage equality that didn't exist in normative marriage. So I feel that, and there are other changes that have been happening, really quickly that kind of have, rendered moot the raison d'existence of what we call the patriarchy, right? Like there is no reason anymore, and so I feel that makes it even more possible for us to identify with each other in ways that are not, like genital based. So I think it's just like kind of like a need for definitions and maybe coining words, right? New terms, and for sure with all the expansion of gender identification that we have now, we're leaving behind this like male versus female. And also, again, when we speak of the patriarchy, we must account for all the males or genital, biologically males throughout history, like throughout the 6,000 years, who were not at all patriarchs, right? Who were the second born or the third born or, queer or, all the misfits who were equally, oppressed and denied, speech or mocked or shunned or, silenced. So I feel that it's kind of like, it's a difficult issue because the majority, the audience out there, the people who just live their lives and are not focused on this conversation, but are somewhat aware of it in the back of their minds, understand it as, I'm a guy and you're a girl, and that's what feminism means,
Right.
And, now, like, post Me Too, feminism is like, nasty, to quote our president. Because, like, it gets to accuse me of, like, not getting consent. I don't even know what consent is, like, right? So there is, we got to get the majority to catch up and incorporate in, like, daily practice what we're talking about, So part of my question as to where we're going, what's the future, what's in, where can we take this, involves this, how do we get this accessibility, where, we bring in to this conversation the mass consciousness, right? The consciousness of the people who haven't had the time and the privilege, to study it and become more versed in it.
Yeah, I mean, I just want to say really quickly, I guess, that as you say, the kind of like Trumps of the world and so many people who are reacting against, like, the successes of the feminist and kind of gay rights movements and trans liberation movements, and ongoing civil rights efforts, that there's this constant effort towards definition that I think is central. So as you're saying, like, there's a sort of simplicity of, like, a worldview that's like, like, that's a man, that's a woman, like, that's just how it is. This is like an act of defining. And so I think it's important, just because it seems simple, it's because there's a lot backing it, like, a lot of people have a lot invested in maintaining, like, these kinds of structures. So I think that it's important for us to understand this as an ongoing act of definition, and then maybe to try to focus less on what the right kind of, say, in the question of, like, a feminist politics, what the right kind of a woman is, whether it's, like, requires these kinds of behaviors, not having that kind of job, like, so on and so forth, but rather more about how we can remain committed to helping women generally, and to work towards a sort of equality more generally, right? And this works through, I think, being open to challenging our own definitions of people and our own understandings of people. And that's something we can do every day in our interactions, I think, with others, to be receptive to what that other people might give us about themselves.
Yeah, I also just wanted to add to that. I think that's very well articulated, Jesse. But also that I think, like, for people who are interested in moving the conversation about feminism to what I consider to be the most progressive and eminently important political place, I think that it's about what I see happening a lot with people who get a lot of their information from people that they follow online, is that, like we were talking about, there's, like, a lot of different perspectives about what feminism is. And I think it's very important for people to try their best to, like, craft their own personal agendas about feminism and about what we think is going to, like, help and support women the most. And I think the most crucial issue for what I think feminism should be is to align itself with helping the most marginalized people in the United States and within, like, the feminist community. So I think by focusing on how to identify structural issues that are reproducing gendered violence outside of intimate individual responsibilities. So by moving the analysis from individual to systematic, or to systemic, excuse me, especially in conversations with individual people. So it's, like, no longer about, like, okay, who are we defining as a woman? What are the politics of man, girl, boy? And being like, well, actually, what's really important to me about feminism is talking about the ways that we can, like, the ways that we can support policies and political programs that are going to help the most women today, right now. I think that we can make huge strides in like political organizing and pushing forward a positive and progressive agenda. This isn't to say that like the politics of naming and identity and individualism aren't important, but I think that so often conversations about what the stakes are of feminism get stuck in those kinds of conversations, and they get very like individual and personal, and they become about like who we are as like different types of people. And I'm actually not interested in those kinds of definitions when it comes to feminism as like a political program. I'm interested in how we can commit ourselves to political movements that are anti-racist, anti-prison, anti-capitalist, and that are focused on abolishing the prison system and police, because and by bringing economic justice to as many women as possible, because I know that those things will improve the lives of women way more than debating whether there's like XYZ like man woman like Trump politics with somebody. In terms of like what I think is like the most important issues of feminism today. What do you have anything to add to that?
No, I mean, I think that's right. I think that a lot of the time, like the ideas about like gendered identity that we take for granted can hide our involvement in other kinds of our complicity in certain kinds of oppression of other people. And so, I don't know. It's always a bit of a double movement. I think it's like important to interrogate, the way that we define ourselves relative to the world in order to ultimately help us best understand how to commit ourselves to improving the lives of others, I think, and to creating a more equal livability of life for other people.
Yeah, livability and sustainability of life, and the environment. We'll put that aside. That's like the ticking bomb. So, I think that's, I mean, I feel that that's really the answer, that, we got to kind of like see what's happening in the streets and what's needed and participate in that. And at the same time, we can always, think of language as like activism, of our use of language as an activist practice, which is something we can just do on our own every day. We don't need to, basically, organize or create movements. We can just practice it in some conscious way. So what are you each working on, or do you know what your thesis or dissertations topics are?
Sure. Yeah. So I'm only in my second year, so I'm still developing my work. But the project that I'm working on right now, I like to say, like, broadly, my interests are in the 3 Bs of bodies, borders, and babies.
Huh.
So I'm. Yeah, which is a little catchy. But I am interested in the way that nationalism in the United States and national boundaries are invested in migrant women's reproduction and controlling the reproduction of migrant women at the border. So I completed my master's last summer, and I was working on looking at the development of migrant reproductive control from forced sterilization practices in the 1970s to, in 2017, there was a case in which a undocumented migrant teenager was refused an abortion in detention. Not detention, excuse me, in a refugee living situation, because she was a minor. So I'm really interested in the ways that nationalism and national identity in the United States is invested in maintaining a population that is grounded in like settler colonial Christian ideals of family and purity, and how that is interacted in variously, often contradictory ways on different types of bodies. bodies of migrants as they attempt to migrate to the United States. So I see my work very broadly as connected to the project of abolition feminism, because I do believe in abolishing borders. And I see prisons and borders as very synonymous types of carceral systems in the U.S. And yeah, that's my current project.
Yeah, I think I just want to add one thing to that, which I've thought about this a long time, and it's a bigger topic, and I just want to kind of insert it here parenthetically. But I came to America to kind of run away from the extreme oppression, right, that I experienced in the old world. I was 15. I didn't know anyone. I came 100% for freedom, and I think that I'm pretty typical that way, right? That it was most of those who migrate to America and have been the outliers, the misfits, the rejects of the normative society. So, and since America is such a young country, I have always felt that it will inevitably come to its senses, right, and no longer try to copy the modality of the old nations, that we all have run away from, right? That they oppressed us. That's why we came all the way out here, where no one spoke our language. We didn't know anyone, but somehow America keeps forgetting that and wanting to fit in and wanting to be understood, in that very limiting way. And as a result, we have everything that we abhor about it, whether it's imperialism or all of these wars or the military industrial complex controlling so much, slavery, of course, that whole history and so on and so on. But the Department of Homeland Security, which is why what I wanted to add, parenthetically add, is so recent, right? And I remember thinking about that when it was created, I think by Bush, right? And I felt let's not go into that homeland narrative. I was raised on the homeland. As a Greek, it was we have to die for the homeland, the fatherland. I was born in a junta. My dad worked for the junta. So, right, you can imagine how much of that, the homeland first nationalistic spirit, I was raised in. And I was happy to come here where everybody was different and everybody, especially in Miami. But, wherever I've lived in America, it's been very cosmopolitan. So, I haven't been in societies where we think of America as homeland, right? So just even coining the term, I feel, inevitably leads, our government to, again, engage in those nationalistic practices, of homogenizing and limiting, controlling the borders and limiting migration, which are against the foundation of this, young country. Of this young group of us. So yeah, I feel that it was misnamed and misconceived, and look how it's been used since it was created. It hardly anymore is interested in terror, anti-terrorism. So whether it's in Portland or in the border, it has exceeded its reason for being, and has become just a controlling fascistic army, attacking the citizens. And those who would be citizens under American under the American ideals. of citizenship, right? So hopefully it won't last long. That Department of Homeland Security.
Yeah, I mean, I think everything you're saying is absolutely correct. And I think really what was one of the big parts of my project is tracing the historic investment of things like the Department of Homeland Security and more generally this like idea of the United States as like this exactly like you were saying, like imperial power in the world. The way that these things have been invested in certain kinds of bodies and controlling the reproduction of certain kinds of bodies and certain kinds of families. And Eva, I think you would be very interested in a book that came out, I think, last year called Homeland Maternity.
Oh, yeah. Totally.
By Natalie Ruiz. Yeah, it's a very, it's exactly what we're talking about. So,
yeah. Jesse?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I'm also really interested in this question of the relationship between American imperial and historically, like, you know, British imperial relationships to the misfits, as you say, like kind of especially in terms of like people who come into conflict with normal ways of living their gendered lives or their sexual lives. And the kind of different kinds of stakes that happen. So on the one hand, like the U.S. is such a safe place for, you know, queer people and for trans people. At the same time, it's like extremely homophobic and extremely transphobic. And it has this kind of like, you know, this kind of like, kind of weird tension that then it takes other places in these kinds of imperial projects. So you get like George Bush or like American conservatives defending like the war in Iraq as a sort of liberation movement. Like this is like a good thing for democracy and like bring like sexual freedom to people who can then like finally live in like the feminist democratic utopia that only the US can provide, while simultaneously doing, you know, like nothing for gay people internally or whatever. It's like this weird like double think where you just end up with like, you know, the imperial power like patting itself on the back for its tolerance while like basically persecuting like deviant groups inside and abroad. Yeah. So I kind of my own work deals with this in a kind of historical recovery of trans people in the 19th century mostly, and looking at the way in which because I guess on the one hand we tend to think of trans life as a very contemporary, very recent thing, like it's very new, maybe like since the 90s that like trans people have been figuring in culture and we like are aware of this existence. But so part of my work is to contribute to scholarship that's, you know, trying to look back over like a longer history and point to the ways in which not only have trans people existed in Britain or in the US or in Western, so quote unquote, kind of like the global North for ages, but that the notion of just like man and woman as two stable categories for human is itself like a very colonial construct, and that it was something that was imposed at home and abroad in this kind of way. So yeah, my own work is looking at the long history of trans people and the relationship to empire, but also to biology, and that's kind of really the interest for me is like if we understand trans people to have been around for so long, like what does this do to our ideas about evolutionary theory and biology and the kinds of explanations that we tend to give about what a man and a woman are? You know, if we understand these to be kind of localized ideas that don't exist across all time and space and all, you know, different kinds of species, then what does it mean to challenge that kind of binary view at the biological level, even, I guess. Yeah, but mostly I just read novels, I guess.
Yeah. I think that, you know, I mean, I agree completely. We definitely have, you know, at least in my Greek, culture, ancient history has numerous examples of like trans people, of different different stages of transition. But in every, from every stage of transitioning, really, and the same goes with like all of the ancient cultures. I mean, I know that in India, the tradition of the hijras is, very ancient. So yeah, it feels that it has been, the more that the categories, are kind of like defined, the more easily people are controlled and oppressed. So it's in no one's, except for like the extreme minority in charge, it's in no one else's interest to kind of like continue to like put ourselves in separate categories. And that's one of the messages that it'd be great if we could like share with everyone. Yeah, and I feel that as important as it is to understand these issues, and where whom they serve, whom our oppression serves. It's equally important to find ways to kind of reunite. So. What you mentioned in the beginning, Chloe, with feminism being so fractured these days, I think is one of the challenges, going forward. So for me, I would love to see us, become kind of like more accepting of all of us, and and reuniting in some inclusive way.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I think that's why we're seeing such an emphasis on like theories of intersectionality and other terms similar to that, because people, I think that I think post failure of Hillary Clinton presidency bid, there have been like a lot of resurgences of old fractures of feminism. But I think the one that I find to be the most progressive and the most appealing, and the one that I believe in the most, is a celebration and emphasis on difference and on different needs, and recognizing difference as a way to abstract from individual politics of being a good or bad person, and about reframing a feminist agenda, not just whether like one individual is like a good or a bad feminist, or whether there's like a way to live your life that is like a good or bad like feminist approach, and being like, what are the issues that are affecting women, and how can I invest in what are the issues that are affecting the women that are the most vulnerable in the United States right now, and how can I align myself with those movements, and how can I listen to the people who are advocating for those issues and believe them when they tell me that these are the issues that are affecting them, and let them speak for themselves.
Yeah.
Something else I was going to say, I forgot. Did I make you think of anything?
Do you want to say anything else, Jesse?
No, I love all of this. I think it's right. I think that that a lot of the homogenizing ideas about what feminism is have been really like challenged, and that, as you say, like there's this kind of big fracturing. It feels like in a lot of ways, but I hope that we can understand this as an opportunity to keep differences involved, and to keep a plurality of voices, and let everyone kind of be speaking, rather than trying to assume that there's one voice that should speak on behalf of all people.
Right. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. So long as I agree. The challenge is to just not think of each other as the other. But kind of like incorporate everything in a feeling of like we, and it's a challenge, but. That's why we're doing this. So thank you for coming. Thank you for spending your hour with me and with our listeners. I enjoyed it very much. And to everyone out there, until next week, thank you for listening, and keep speaking sex. So we're excited to announce our partnership with oldplayground.net. It's the site to go to if you're in any way curious about what to do next in your sex life. If I could make love incessantly, I would be God.